Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen speaking. This is part two of a series of the relationship between the mind, psychosocial factors, and cancer. So, since this is part two, if you haven't listened to part one, I'd recommend that you go back on the YouTube channel and listen to it because the information here will make more sense as it builds on it. Now, this part two is a bit more optimistic. It's about spontaneous and not so spontaneous remissions. The role of the mind or psychosocial spiritual factors in the healing of cancer. So I'll share some personal experiences. I've been fortunate enough to spend time with and speak to a few people who have had not so spontaneous remissions from cancer, and also take a look at the scientific literature. And I'll do my best to separate what seems to be anecdotal and what seems to be more scientific. So the first guy that I'm aware of who documented that you could use your mind to heal cancer was an Australian medical doctor who was also a specialist in hypnosis and meditation by the name of Aynsley Mears. He wrote what was probably the first kind of self-help book in applying meditation to various medical conditions in his 1967 book, Relief Without Drugs. There's also a book about him and the work that he did with cancer that I recommend. Now, Aynsley Mears documented several cases of remissions of cancer from patients who had been given up by traditional medicine and essentially had been told to go home and die. So these are actually documented cases in both Australian and North American medical journals in the 70s. Now, Aynsley Mears' theory was that chronic stress, chronic anxiety and fear more or less turned off our immune responses. And that by these high levels of cortisol and noradrenaline and adrenaline, the stress hormones over time constantly, our immune system would no longer be able to function well. And the whole idea was that we essentially have cancer cells all the time, but we have mechanisms within us that we loosely call the immune system that seem to be able to take care of it, and that chronic deep anxiety over time can put those mechanisms offline to the extent that cancer and other ills may develop. So this is, back then that was a very, very controversial theory. It was called a quack and a charlatan, and met a lot of resistance. Today that theory isn't, well, you'll still probably get a lot of anger and aggression if you speak about it, but it's not that far out anymore, to be frank. So his theory was that if he could get his patients into a profound stillness, if he could get them to experience profound stillness and relaxation and insights into their deeper self, that if he could do that and do that for prolonged periods of time, then the mind-body system might then be able to heal and deal with the cancers. And this is what happened in at least a few cases. So I've been foolish enough to lend away the book with Aynsley Mears and cancer. I never lend away my books usually, but so I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. But what I can remember from memory is that he said that virtually all his patients who did this had less anxiety, more relaxation, more inner peace, were able to deal with it better. Many had a strong reduction in pain and suffering. Quite a few lived a lot longer than their prognosis and their medical doctors would have predicted. And a smaller number than that actually had remissions where they completely healed. Now, the type of meditation that Mears had his patients do was not a standard, 20-minute a day mindfulness type exercise. It was a completely nonverbal, still, deep meditation for hours. So a typical regime would be 1 hour of meditation 3 to 5 times a day. So we're talking that amount. So of course, this kind of screens for patients who might have an inclination to want to do meditation and who are really, really committed. But if it's life or death, it's it's probably worth doing. So that's something to check out as a reference. One of the call it miracle cases that's been very well documented and now followed up for 40 years was a at the time 25-year-old Australian man by the name of Ian Goller, who was thought to have days to live. He was extremely ill with metastatic bone cancer, and he did the intense type of meditation that Aynsley Mears taught him to do, and was a very dedicated patient and had a complete remission that stunned the medical world. And as of today, this was back in 1978, he's still alive, no cancer. And he spent his life since then working with cancer patients and has helped quite a few other people to do similar stuff. So I'd recommend his biography, which is really, really interesting. If you're looking to do stuff that you're not supposed to be able to do in the culture that you're living, it's very useful to read biographies and get a peek into the mind of people to do this stuff. So he has a biography. He also has a book called You Can Conquer Cancer, which outlines his program and where he also documents the medical reports and the follow-ups 30 years later. So that's also really, really interesting stuff. The next stuff I'm going to say to you is more anecdotal, but spirituality or meditation as a tool to discover or access the very deep stillness that we fundamentally are as human beings, to be able to connect with that and spend time there seems to be a common denominator for a lot of the people who have had remissions when they weren't supposed to. There's a medical doctor by the name of Kelly Turner, who has written also a book, this is for those of you who are interested, obviously, called Radical Remission, where she has interviewed documented cases of people who have had remissions from cancer when they weren't supposed to. And whether it's been through meditation or spending time with an enlightened being or sometimes through religion, deep experiences of self-transcendence, deep experiences of connecting with our true nature and the stillness, love, and peace that we fundamentally are, consciousness itself, seems to often enable us to activate whatever we might have available as healing resources. So there's enough examples of that it's worth checking out. In addition to the type of meditation that Aynsley Mears talked about, other interesting sources are sources that fall under the banner of the direct path. So Dzogchen meditation, essentially designed to help you see through the illusion of the separate self, and to realize the oneness of life. Um, Sydney Banks' three principles model, if you will, of psychology and spirituality seems to me to be a very profound and useful way, the way many of these people teach to help people to realize that they are this oneness, this stillness, and that they essentially are consciousness itself. And I had a conversation once at a seminar with George Pransky where I asked him, have you ever seen any remissions from cancer or other serious diseases? And he said yes. During the early days of spending time with Sydney Banks, Sydney Banks was the Scottish welder who lived in Canada, who had this profound enlightenment experience. So during the early days of people listening to him, there were apparently, according to George Pransky, several people who had remissions not only from cancer but other serious illnesses just by spending time around Sydney Banks and listening to him and connecting with that stillness and that deeper intelligence that we fundamentally are. Kelly Turner talks about this healer in Brazil, John of God, who seems to have more of a Christian orientation, where she has spent time and spoken to people and actually documented that you've had several people who were supposed to die who have had profound spiritual experiences, which sometimes have resulted in healing of the cancer. So these are also directions to look in. If you remember from the first episode, I talked about how people who develop cancer, people who can't show anger on their own behalf, people who have too much self-appeasement or too afraid of conflict, and who essentially spend their lives attempting to be who they think other people want them to be for love or approval, who have lost touch with their own emotions and their own deeper self, their own deeper intelligence, if you will. That whole tendency is a profound misunderstanding. And this is why I'm advocating the three principles here. I'm not saying that it's a cure, that there's any technique or anything like that. But what I am saying is that when people live their life in that way, with that type of psychological orientation, the big misunderstanding is that the love that they're seeking through approval, the inner peace that they think they will have if they get approval and if they're able to live up to the standards that they think other people have of them, that's who they already are. And this is what all schools of spirituality essentially point people towards, is to have the realization that you already are the freedom, the love, the stillness, the peace that you're searching for. You are what you're searching for. So it's a profound misunderstanding to attempt to seek it in accomplishment and in approval. So it's one thing to intellectually hear this, but if you can discover it, if you can discover that is who you actually are, then that's a game changer. That's a game changer. And if you can realize that your experience is made from thought, you're actually experiencing a thought-generated reality that's all generated within consciousness. To the extent that you can see that, the tendencies I talked about will automatically fall away. because you'll have the realization that your feelings don't come from the outside. They don't come from accomplishment or approval or situations or stuff out there. They're actually generated on the inside, and meaning is projected out. So the more you can have realizations of the oneness of life, of being the stillness and peace that you're looking for, and realizing that your experience is thought generated in consciousness, the less anxiety, the less neuroticism you'll have. So this is also a very useful direction to look in. If you won't look in that particular direction, I highly recommend looking at rational emotive behavior therapy, neurolinguistic programming, CBT, anything that helps you discover that what you're experiencing is a interpretation of what's going on. That also is a key point. Because I talked about hopelessness, that there seems to be a strong correlation between responding to life's losses and traumas with a sense of hopelessness. Now, this is something that you can change. Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology, has done some good work showing that people who have a tendency to get depressed and respond with hopelessness and helplessness, after a loss, have a tendency to do the 3 Ps. They have a tendency to take it personally, to think that it's permanent, and that it's pervasive, of all contexts. This is a typical pattern for people who depress. So learning to evaluate stuff as impersonal, to contextualize it, and to set it within a time frame will take away that tendency to respond with hopelessness. So that also seems to be something else. Now, of course, you're still going to have pain in life. You're still going to have sorrows. You're still going to have all that stuff. But the whole idea that, if you remember the first episode of this, where I talked about how many cancer patients will put all their eggs in one basket, and the relationship that they're in, the career that they might be in, or their role as a mother, or as a spouse, becomes their role in life. It becomes their identity. And then when they lose that, there is a sense of hopelessness. There's a sense of being lost, and the immune response, seems to shut off. The more you realize that you are what you're looking for, and that your experience is thought generated inside of you, the more you'll see that the roles and the identities are made up. They're illusory. And that will also equip you to handle life's challenges in a much, much better way. So another thing here that I have to mention is imagery, guided imagery, visualizations, deliberately using your mind, both to generate positive feeling states and also to do direct imagery on the disease process with the intent to heal it in and of itself. This sounds really weird to people, but I want to bring you something here from 1980 in the journal Psychosomatics. You had a team of Carl Simonton, his wife, whose name was also Simonton, and a person named Matthews, who wrote the book, who worked with, I'll find this here, 159 patients who were diagnosed with terminal cancer. So 159 patients who were given up by traditional medicine and who were diagnosed to be terminal. They had a program, with meditation and guided imagery and conflict resolution and all that type of stuff. So they the average life expectancy for people in their group was about 12 months. Now, if we look at the numbers here, 4 years later, 63 of the patients are still alive. And the average lifespan of the people who did die were 24.4 months. So around twice as long as the people who, well, twice as long as expected. So 4 years later, the people who had a complete remission, no sign of cancer whatsoever, were 14 patients. So that's 22.2% of the people. The people who had tumors that were regressing, had gotten less, were 19.1%. The people who were completely stable, no change, was 27.1%. And the people who had new tumors, larger tumors, were 31.8%. So remember that 100% of these people were considered completely terminal. Now that's damn impressive. That's damn impressive. And this was back in 1980. And a lot of the stuff that they did back then was considered rather crude, So, of course, there's enormous resistance, in medical circles to even look at stuff like this, because it completely challenges the paradigm. Take a look at hypnosis. I'm going to share the most dramatic case that I know is documented, which is not actually a cancer case, but it's something considered to be genetic. And this is from a book called Hypnosis and Counseling in the Treatment of Chronic Illness, which is a really interesting book. Have some patience with me here. So this is called, I can't even pronounce this, ichthyosiform erythrodermia of Brock. Fishscale disease, in which the sufferer's skin becomes thick and brittle, breaking with movement and leaving wounds that heal only to break again. So although it's been seen as a genetic disease, it's been successfully treated by hypnosis in at least 5 cases. The dramatic effect of this cure is demonstrated very effectively in a television documentary on this subject. So here's some interesting. The first guy to do it was a guy called Dr. Albert A. Mason. And he talks about his client that he calls John. And he says the patient was a horrible sight. His whole body, apart from his face, neck, and chest, was covered by a black substance that bore no resemblance to normal skin. Later he wrote, to touch the skin felt as hard as a normal fingernail and was so inelastic that any attempt at bending resulted in a crack in the surface, which would then ooze blood-stained serum. Pretty bad. So he mistakenly, here's an interesting thing too, he mistakenly thought that the patient's problem was thousands of warts covering the skin, and it's been known for a long time that you can use hypnosis with warts. So, and after an unsuccessful attempt by a consultant surgeon to graft skin on a patient whose body was around 70 to 80% affected by this black Fishscale condition, he volunteered to remove the supposed warts by hypnosis. This he did by suggesting to the patient that all the warts on his left arm would drop off, and then told him to come back a week later. A week later, when the patient returned, the seemingly hundreds of warts on his arm had indeed gone and were replaced with normal skin. When Mason showed this arm to his senior colleague, the surgeon was shocked and said, "Good God, man, do you know what you've done?" He was given the name of the disease and told to go look it up. And to his astonishment, discovered that he had successfully treated a genetic condition caused by the absence of oil-forming glands. He continued to do this, and he reached improvements on 50% of the patient's legs and feet, 90% of the arms, and complete clearing of the palms, although the fingers were not greatly improved. After 3 years, this has remained stable. This genetic disease has been successfully treated by hypnosis in at least 5 cases. So what I've also read and heard is that Mason, the fact that he thought at the time that it was warts was what gave him the confidence to actually, give it a go. And that later, in his case, when he discovered that it was supposedly impossible, he was never able to quite replicate the attempts. Now, let me be clear here. Hypnosis per se doesn't heal or cure anything. It's always the patient's or the client's own resources that does the job. Just the same as with the Aynsley Mears meditation examples. But it points to something else, and that is that some of these healings have happened by accident. As in the case of Mason, he thinks he's working with something else that he knows is possible to do, and as a result, his patient makes changes which are completely, supposedly impossible. It's very likely that if Mason had known what the disease was, he wouldn't even attempt it. Or if he had attempted, he would have been so incongruent that the patient wouldn't have activated anything else either. So my point with this is that it takes an unconventional mindset to be able to work effectively with stuff like this, because the social conditioning, the social norms, the cultural norms, the amount of anger and skepticism and ridicule that you'll get from people if you even propose this stuff is so much. So and looking at people I've had the chance to spend time with myself, I remember, for example, one client who, when we talk about trauma, if you think about something that's acute, sudden, dramatic, and socially isolating, and you respond with hopelessness, that seems to be the biggie. That seems to be the huge one. If you'll remember the study that I referred to in part 1 of women who had these types of traumatic experiences and were socially isolated, were 9 times more likely to develop breast cancer. So this woman had a relationship, a marriage, where her husband, was her identity was one of being the spouse. That was her life. He was her source of love and connection. And she had gotten a new best friend. Didn't have that many friends, but this was her new best friend, who was the babysitter of the kids. And one day she comes home and she finds them in bed together, and got completely cold. Was never able to show any anger, toward, but she said she felt she got sick right then and there. It was as if somebody just pulled the carpet, out of the floor, out of her life, and she developed ovarian cancer shortly thereafter. Now, if you see enough cases like this, you begin to realize that while it's unethical to oversell psychosocial factors, it's extremely unethical to ignore and pretend that this is just biology and just mechanical. It's just not true. So let me so if you've experienced trauma, deal with it. Do trauma writing, or do hypnotic regression work, or do havening touch. Find someone who can help you to release the trauma and reach out socially and change your patterns of responding with hopelessness. It's so destructive to send out the idea that, well, cancer doesn't care. showing videos of people who are enjoying life and doing something meaningful, that's not the road to health. It really, really isn't. Now, finally, I want to talk about social support and having reasons for living and intuition. By the way, as Kelly Turner writes about in her book on radical remissions, one factor is following your intuition. Now, the people who are able to get in touch with that deeper intelligence inside of them suddenly have guidance in life. They suddenly begin to live their own lives. And here is a common denominator of people who have recovered when they shouldn't, and it's that. It's like that book titled Dying to Be Me. It's very often people realizing that they've lost touch with themselves. They've lived the life that other people have designed for them. And it's often this profound shift in consciousness where they get in touch with their true nature and they live a guided life from the inside. So a more authentic life, a life on one's own terms, seems to be the big common denominator. As Lawrence LeSean points out, as soon as you lose meaning, as soon as life loses its meaning, a lot of people will be more predisposed to develop cancer. So meaning is very important. But meaning isn't really out there. It's in here. It's internally generated. Um, Here's something controversial, but I don't care for political correctness, so I'll say it anyways. Sometimes I think cancer can be a socially acceptable form of suicide, a way of escaping the perceived burden of life. If you say this to a family member of someone with cancer, they'll rip your head off. But the cancer patient himself, will often nod along with you. There's this recognition on the inside, and I've seen people begin to make progress and then bail out. Um, I've on occasion offered to work with people completely for free that I've helped with other stuff in the past who have great rapport with me, who have refused, just flat out refused to do it. I remember really well a client I saw almost 20 years ago for panic attacks, depression, chronic pain, heavy smoker. She was one of those miracle clients who came back a decade later or so, who had a relapse with the smoking. So we did that, and I discovered that she had developed multiple sclerosis and was really suffering with it. And I said, "Would you like to see if you and I can make anything happen? In terms of you having a remission from the multiple sclerosis, free of charge?" And she turned me down. Didn't want to do it. So if you work in this area for a while, you'll begin to see that there might be something to that. It's really harsh. It sounds horrible to say that cancer can be a socially acceptable way of escaping the burden of life. But you better be willing to have that conversation with your clients. Because sometimes, as Steve Parkhill, a noted hypnotherapist who's done a lot of work with this stuff, says, he'll say that very often there is a self-mutilation program, either as punishment or not wanting to live or not deserving to live, that can run in the unconscious mind. And you'll see this. People start developing one type of symptom and then another type of symptom. They might have one form of cancer, they get treatment, then something else comes up, and something else comes up, and you might want to wonder what on earth is going on. What on earth is going on the inside? And sometimes you better be willing to have that conversation and help people deal with that and turn that around. So it's not work for the meek. Um, Now, finally, social support. David Spiegel, who's actually a hypnosis guy and a psychiatrist, was of the opinion that psychological factors had nothing to do with the development or healing of cancer. And he was angry at people even proposing it, and he famously talked about it as wishing away your cancer when he heard about people like Simonton and stuff like that. So he was able to organize this huge landmark study where he and other people would do work with terminal breast cancer clients. They would meet 90 minutes every week to essentially explore death and fear and grief, a rather deep existential type psychotherapy. And they would be taught self-hypnosis for pain control. And Spiegel had no expectancy that this would alter, anything in terms of the disease, perhaps the experience of it, but not the disease. And to his big surprise, doing a follow-up, a few years later, discovered that the people in that group, as compared to a control group, lived twice as long. I'll say it again, they lived twice as long. The difference that made the difference was the social supports. And there has been several studies done since then, most of them, the vast majority of them, demonstrating Spiegel's findings. So it does matter whether you're engaged, whether you have a meaningful life, whether you are socially connected and have good relationships. Having said that, I know of plenty of people who have tried to do this stuff and who have died anyways. There's probably more people in that camp. And Sydney Banks, who I mentioned, died of cancer. Ironically, Carl Simonton died of cancer. So mentioning these things is just a matter of intellectual honesty. As I said, there's probably a danger here in overselling psychological factors. I acknowledge that there are other factors at play, and that all the things that I've mentioned here may apply greatly, or might be just a small piece of the puzzle. So at the risk of overselling it, I'm making those points, and I'm also arguing, as I said in the previous episode, not mind over matter, but that mind matters, and that it's more dangerous to pretend that the connections aren't there when there actually is so much to support it. So that's it for now. Feel free to comment on the video. Feel free to engage. If you know anyone who has had remissions, I would love to hear about it. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to put them at the Provocative Hypnosis YouTube channel. So I hope this was useful. I hope this was inspiring. I hope it might make you consider, how you live your own life in terms of cancer prevention. Can't prove this, but it's likely, if you take these things into account, that you'll be less likely to develop cancer. And also how you raise your kids. Knowing this information, how might you raise your kids differently? Because ultimately, whether you are connected to that life force, that spark, that meaning inside of you, matters. It really does matter. So hope this was useful. Thanks.